In this video we're going to be looking at negative externalities, and then in the next video we'll look at what's meant by positive externalities, and then in the final video, each going for about 5 minutes, we're going to look at how to answer some more difficult questions looking at both negative and positive externalities. So what are externalities? You need to be able to say why are they good or bad, and why do we tax externalities, and what's meant by what we call the private and social cost of a transaction. So externalities arise when a person is engaged in a transaction that affects the well-being of a third party. That's the key term, this idea of a third party, okay, who's not involved in the transaction. They can be positive or negative and can occur in production or consumption. So they can occur when we produce things, for example when we produce and emit carbon dioxide that can cause climate change, or when we consume things. So an example of that is when people smoke and they affect others via passive smoking. The third party is those that are harmed by passive smoking. Producers and consumers often ignore these third-party externalities. So we always talked about producers and consumers being self-interested. So we're continuing along that theme that we don't care about the impacts on third parties. So when producers are producing and emitting carbon, unless they are taxed, they don't care about the impacts on climate change. Okay, so here's examples of some positive and negative externalities. You can see some negative externalities in consumption, so things that cause impacts or negative impacts to third parties when we consume them, and we'll go through some of these. Negative externalities that are caused when we produce certain things, very relevant ones are things like intensive farming, any type of activity that causes pollution. And then we have positive externalities in consumption and production, which we'll talk about in the next video. So what's important to recognise that externalities cause a divergence between the private and social costs or benefits of production or consumption. So what I mean by that is we've got our private benefits and our private costs. So a firm's private costs would all be all their costs of production, but it also may impose social costs on society. So that might be the pollution that they cause that affects local rivers, local lakes, that affects animals, that affects other people. So social costs include all the costs of production, so they include the private costs and the third-party costs, which might include, e.g., pollution for the atmosphere. So when you go to the supermarket and you buy petrol, you really only consider the private costs, but you're not considering the impacts that it has on third parties. So that's why the government has to tax it. Okay, so here's some examples of negative externalities. And what's really important that you state in your answers is that in free markets we over-allocate resources to areas with negative externalities. Because we don't internalize the social costs, or we don't care about the social costs, we over-allocate resources to these areas. So negative externalities in production: when we transport goods, we burn fossil fuels, that pollutes the air, that pollutes the environment for future generations, the third party. When we burn brown coal for electricity, so when we use coal for electricity, that causes climate change. Okay, and the negative externality of climate change, be really specific here in what that negative externality is. It's the fact that in the future we're going to have rising sea levels. Okay, people are going to be, the negative externalities of some people are going to be living underwater, or their houses are going to become flooded. It will cause airborne diseases, it will cause cyclones, hurricanes, floods. All of that is the negative externality, the third-party cost of climate change. And then we have our negative externalities in consumption, so things when we consume them. Alcohol is a good example. Alcohol, the negative externality is not your health being affected, because that's affecting you as the consumer. The negative externality is the fact that if you binge drink, you might cause violence and hurt other people. Or if you get really sick, the health costs for you, to society, of paying for your medication or your operations, that would be the third-party cost. Underage use of motor vehicles, if they're crashing, that has a big third-party cost. Cigarettes through passive smoking, increased medical bills, so it might hurt taxpayers. Decide to have a party, your third-party cost is your neighbours having to be up all night. Buying a dog, your neighbours being up all night again. All of these things have negative externalities for third parties. Driving a car, okay, again, causes climate change. So a good thing to remember with climate change is actually a negative externality in both production and consumption, because it occurs when we produce goods and services, because they emit carbon dioxide, and it also occurs when we do things like running electricity and driving our car. So climate change is a negative externality in both production and consumption that cause an over-allocation of resources. And I've just explained what some of the third-party costs are. Okay, how do they stop undesirable production? How do they ensure that these socially undesirable goods aren't produced? Okay, well, what they can do is they can use taxes. We know taxes will raise the relative price and raise the production costs. And basically what they're doing, and this terminology is really important, they're internalizing the external cost that has been imposed on a third party. So they're basically forcing the producer to pay for that external cost that they haven't been paying for. So they're making the private cost equal to the social cost, and that's really important. Using that terminology, they're internalizing the external cost. Okay, and we know that higher prices will decrease demand, so resources will shift out of these areas, and therefore we will get a more socially optimal amount of production and consumption. Okay, so here's an example of a tax. This might be something like an alcopops tax or a carbon tax. It's shifted the supply curve to the left, so we were supplying at a point here, and now we're supplying at a more socially optimal level. Okay, making the producers pay for the social costs, which they might pass on to consumers, and therefore there's less resources allocated to that market. And if you get a question like that, explain the whole equilibrium analysis. So there'll be a shortage, then we raise the price, and that causes a contraction in demand and expansion in supply. Often these taxes aren't all that effective though, because the products have an inelastic demand. So when we raise the price, consumers are willing to pay for things for like cigarettes still, and therefore they're less effective. Other ways that we can reduce negative externalities, age identification, okay, so making sure that underage people aren't going to clubs which have third-party costs. Licensing, so there's obviously third-party costs if just random people have guns. Obviously that can have massive impacts if it affects people's lives, if anybody gets shot or hurt. Law prohibiting production and consumption, so stopping people from producing heroin and marijuana. It's really important that heroin is something that has a massive third-party cost. So it's really important that we remove that from society, and we decide the socially optimal amount of heroin consumption is 0, so it's banned. Alcohol, we're accepting some production because it doesn't have as negative impacts on society, and people get a lot of benefit from its production and consumption. Government inspectors to ensure that people are producing the right things as well is another method. Okay, we'll go through this in class because this video has gone for long enough.